This lesson we're going to be using an absolute cell value, whereas before we created the formulas with the rows relative to the other rows. So in this case we're using the B2, C2, and then in the next row it was B3, C3, the next one was B4, C4, but we wanted to keep the tax rate fixed to this absolute cell value of 9% or whatever percent we want to use for the tax. And we can do that by applying the $ for the column and then also the $ for the row. And now when we drag down the formula, it's not going to change that absolute value, but it will still change the relative values to the cells where it's getting the cost and the quantity from. So I'll show you how to do that in this lesson coming up. Looking at the differences between the relative and the absolute references. In the previous lesson, we looked at how we can use a value from the cells, and then as we dragged it down, that value updated. Let's create a value for the tax rate. So tax rate will be 13%. And that was what our tax rate that we want to charge. So typically we saw with the subtotal where we can take the value of B2, multiply it by C2, and that created the total. We can do the autofill for this total, but now we want to calculate the tax rate. And the tax rate will be always the same, so it's not going to be changing as we saw with these relative values. We want it as an absolute value from the cell B9. So set that up, and we're going to take the value of E2 and then multiply it by the value of B9, and that's going to give us the current tax. If we drag it down, this doesn't calculate properly because the next row is going to be automatically incrementing because it's trying to take a relative reference where it's using the value for B10 instead of the B9. So we can, of course, set it as a hard-coded number, but we want to be able to adjust the tax rate and have that reflected within the column D totals. So the way to do that is that we can use the value that we have within B9 as an absolute reference to that cell so that we're not actually changing it. And this is where we can use the $ that will make the absolute reference to that particular cell. So if we update this formula and use the $9 and $B in order to indicate the B9 cell, it's going to keep that as the absolute value. So as we drag it down, that value of 13% will stay as the absolute value in all of the rows of content. Then we can apply the subtotal as needed. So now let's adjust the subtotal to reflect the values multiplied by the tax and get the total for the cost, quantity, plus the tax for the subtotal. So we have to make an adjustment to our formula. We're using B2 and C2. So let's update, instead of going to E2, we're going to paste in the bracketed B2 times C2 and multiply it by B9. And we can drag that down. And the subtotal now will be the value of B2 times C2 plus the value of D. And that will be D2. So the subtotals now will reflect the value, including the tax, according to the values of the quantity and the cost. And update all of these and set the format to be currency. And now to separate out to get the total, I'm going to move these over slightly. And in order to get the total, this is going to be the reflection of the values of the sum of column E. So let's add that in to the formula. So sum of column E, and it's only going to be E2 to E7 for the total sum. Also update this to be a currency. So now we've also, the tax will also be a currency. I'm going to get rid of the 13% up here because now that we've got a changing tax value, so if we were to change this to 11% the tax, then that would also be reflected within the tax and the subtotal. Let's calculate the sum of the tax. So this is all of the contents of column D. So starting at D2 and going all the way to D7. Now in order to pull out the subtotal, we can do a subtraction of the tax from the total and do it backwards, and that will pull out those values. So let's create that, where we're going to use the value of E10 and subtract the value of E9 from there. And that will give us the value before the tax. And the subtotal is going to be including the tax. So you can also indicate that within the values there. Let's make the total bigger so it stands out more. And the subtotal we can even make smaller. You probably won't need the subtotal, but again, this is just another way to do those calculations. Also, if you want to get rid of the contents of these, we can apply some conditional formatting to those. So under the format, conditional formatting, we're going to select the entire range. So let's get the range. And this is going to be everything from D2 all the way to E7. And the format rules. So if it is equal to 0, then the formatting that we're going to apply is we can make the text color white. And what this will do is this is going to hide it from the view. And now if we want to add to it, so let's say we've got another item that we want to add in. Once this total is not 0, it's going to then show it within the view. And also let's update this cost. And this column should also be formatted as currency. And so now it will once again show, and it will work like the other columns, where once we make updates, it'll recalculate the tax, the subtotal, we get the subtotal, tax, and the total that's being charged on this particular order. We can also take the tax rate and adjust it, and then once again that new tax rate is going to be once again reflected within the invoice. So that's how you can set an absolute value for the cell by using the $sign. And the $sign is going to always be an absolute reference across multiple cells. Without the $sign, it gets interpreted as a relative reference. And as we saw, if it's a relative reference, that number, that cell that's referencing will change as we drag down the formula to the following rows of content. Highlight this, and I'll format this to move it over to the left, and I'll move this one over to the right. So we can have the tax rate kind of sitting there on its own so that we can easily see this value.